All right, so we're live. Thank you very much for agreeing to come on to speak to me today. Greg, Jesus Christ, can't even speak today. That's the impact of training before I do a podcast. But yeah, so today, people, we are going to be talking about sleep, but not just sleep in general, but sleep for shift workers, because there is a number of people that I work with who work shift work, and they also have body composition goals to improve their health, goals to improve their performance, and who better to speak to than an actual expert in this subject. So, Greg, I guess it'd be good for us to set the stage here, right? So, in a normal person, how is our kind of sleep cycle working, and what makes it to a point at which the sleep cycle will be essentially optimized?
I think when it comes to the regulation of sleep, there are a few things that are important to understand. And I'll introduce a model early on, because when we think about sleep in the context of shift work, it can be helpful to understand these processes. There was an idea put forward by a guy named Bob Bailey, and his idea was that we can model sleep by looking at two processes. And one of those processes is an intrinsic drive to sleep. The same way that the longer that we've been without food, in general, the longer that we've been awake, the greater the drive to sleep is. And so we can think of this as being a bit like an hourglass timer. Maybe you're playing a card game and each of you needs to have a certain amount of time for your turn. And so you flip the timer and then you watch the sand fall through it. And then when all the sand has passed, it's the next person's go, and then you flip it again. This aspect of sleep is a bit like that. And so you flip the timer when you fall asleep and the sand passes through. And if all the sand passes through, then you've paid off all of the pressure to sleep that's accumulated previously. And then you wake up and you don't have that background sleepiness that exists anymore. But if you flip the timer halfway through, then there's still some sand left. And so it hasn't all dissipated. And therefore you can think about that component in that way. The other process is driven by your body's clock, and it's a drive to be awake. And so if we imagine a situation where someone's woken up in the morning and they're well rested, they've paid off all that sleep pressure, all of the sand has passed through the hourglass timer, then at that time, there's no background sleepiness. So the body's clock doesn't need to produce a strong drive to be awake to oppose that. But as the day goes on, more and more pressure to sleep accumulates. And so you need an increasingly strong drive to be awake to counteract that pressure to stop yourself from falling asleep. And interestingly, the so-called post-lunch slump that a lot of people experience around the middle of the day, roughly 2 p.m, is because there's actually a temporary dip in that drive to be awake at that time of day, which doesn't oppose some of the sleep pressure that's accumulated, and therefore you can start feeling a bit sleepy. So it's less related to lunch and it's more related to your body's clockwork. But then as the evening approaches and we get closer to the sleep period, now the drive to be awake needs to be really, really strong. And that's part of the reason why about 2 hours before you typically fall asleep, it's actually really hard to initiate sleep. If you try to go to bed 2 hours early, you just lie there wide awake. And then around the time that you fall asleep, typically, there's a sudden drop in that drive to be awake. That no longer opposes the sleep pressure that's accumulated previously. And so you can hopefully quickly fall asleep and stay asleep. And what happens in shift work, of course, is that people are often trying to sleep at a time of day where their body's clock is actually promoting wakefulness. And maybe their sleep isn't that restorative, the quality isn't that high, they don't get enough of it, and therefore they never fully dissipate that sleep pressure too. So when they are awake, they've got that kind of background sleepiness they have to contend with, which makes life harder in many different ways. So I think that's a helpful concept to tee up the rest of the conversation. I'll pause there in case there's anything you want to pick up on.
Yeah, I think that analogy used to essentially kind of describe sleep pressure or sleep drive is important to understand. And I guess it's probably something that people who are maybe kind of going into shift work, or they're maybe starting it new, will probably start to really kind of understand as they get into maybe that first night shift, and they're maybe not sleeping in that in that day beforehand, or trying to essentially decrease any of that sleep drive, right? And I guess like one of the challenging things, as you're kind of mentioned there, with the kind of the day, the usual day pattern, but then into the night shifts, is that like light or dark cycle. So like during the day, we're more used to being alert, but then as it comes to evening time and it's getting darker, we're more used to being asleep. What type of challenges does this potentially pose to a person like who's either starting night shifts when it does come to performing well, even at their job during that shift?
The challenge is that in a perfect world, you'd be sleeping at a time of day when your clock is promoting sleep and you'd have lots of pressure to sleep. And so in this instance, someone might be now trying to stay awake when they've got loads of sleep pressure that's accumulated and their wake drive has suddenly dropped off. And so someone needs to understand, well, how do I shift the timing of my clock in order to adjust to my new shift schedule if they are trying to adjust to it? And so this brings up another concept, which is that of entrainment and how your clock responds to so-called time cues, or technical term is Zeitgebers. And these are able to shift the timing of your clock. And when I speak about your clock, what I'm really speaking about is a system of clocks that exists in every cell in your body, but there's a kind of hierarchy within the system. And one analogy that can be helpful for people to imagine how this works is by likening it to an orchestra. And so within your clockwork orchestra, your circadian system orchestra, you have a conductor, and that's in the brain. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus or suprachiasmatic nuclei. And it primarily responds to patterns of light exposure. So if you want to change the timing of this clock in the brain, then the main factor that's going to pull it or push it in different directions is when you're exposed to bright light and darkness, respectively. Simplistically, if you're exposed to very bright light, and there are ways that we can measure that, the unit of light intensity is called the lux. 1 lux is about the intensity of light that's emitted by a candle 1 meter from your eye. Indoor office might have a light intensity of roughly 300 to 500 lux. Outdoors on a sunny day in Spain at midday, the intensity of light might be 120,000 lux. So way, way, way more intense. And it doesn't look that different to us, but your clockwork does actually register that difference. But the composition of the light matters too. It's not just the intensity, but also the spectral composition, the different wavelengths that make up the light. And the clock is more responsive to short wavelength light. And that's why when people speak about trying to avoid blue light at night, for instance, there is some sense to that, because blue light and green light have quite short wavelengths. Full spectrum white light also has those short wavelengths, but they're balanced by longer wavelengths too, which is why it looks a different color. So both the intensity and the wavelengths of light matter, and then the timing of when you're exposed to it matters too. So if you're trying to shift your clock later, then you would want to avoid that type of high intensity, short wavelength, rich light that you would get outdoors under the sun. Especially, so if you're trying to shift later, you would want to avoid that shortly after waking up in the morning, basically from a period from about 2 hours before you would naturally wake up until a few hours after you would naturally wake up. And you would want lots of that type of light exposure from a period from about 2 hours before you would naturally fall asleep until about 2 hours before you would naturally wake up. So in the first 2/3 or so of your sleep period. And what that means is that if we can understand something about the timing of our clock and how our clock responds to light exposure, then we can shift the central clock in the orchestra. And then because that acts as the conductor, it helps shift the other clocks in the orchestra too. Because what it's doing is it's giving the other clocks, the other players in the orchestra, each playing their own instruments, it's giving them cues, telling them when to play, when to stop, and so on. And so light exposure is the most important time cue for us. However, there are other variables that influence the timing of some of the players in the orchestra. And probably the most important of those are physical activity, So strenuous exercise can be a time cue for some of the clocks in our system. And as you might expect, those are the clocks that are particularly important to exercise performance. For example, the clocks in your skeletal muscle and the clocks in your bone, most likely too, probably the clocks in your heart, maybe the clocks in some of the vascular system. And therefore, if we do strenuous exercise around the time that we expose ourselves to the bright light, we'll probably have additive effects on how much our clocks can shift. Exercise can probably independently shift the central clock a little bit, not nearly as much as light exposure, but it might actually be able to shift some of the other clocks in the periphery more, so clocks such as skeletal muscle. And then the other time cue that I'll mention here is when you consume food. And so again, as you might expect, this might be especially relevant to clocks that are important to digestion, metabolism, and detoxification. And so maybe when you eat and when you fast can help reset clocks in tissues such as the gut and the pancreas and the liver and the adipose tissue, fat cells. If we're trying to adapt to a new shift, then we want to try and move all of these to the new schedule. The complication with shift work, of course, is just that a lot of people work rotating shifts. And so the question is, well, how do you cope with that? Because many people might occasionally work a shift which is not in time with the rest of their schedule, and so they don't actually want to adapt the new schedule. Instead, that really is a question of how do I cope best with this? Whereas there are some people that work permanent night shifts, which are notoriously hard to adapt to, particularly outside of very remote settings. So if you're working on an oil rig or something, and everyone is working nights, then that's much more conducive to fully adapting than if you were trying to exclusively work nights and you were living in a city in Spain or the UK or America or somewhere like that. So again, I'll pause there, but the key concept is that we have these clocks throughout our tissues. They respond to light, movement, and food intake. And if we understand how they do respond, then we can shift the timing of these. And then in turn, those clocks coordinate all sorts of processes throughout our body. So what they basically do is they set the timetable of events each day in different cells and tissues, and therefore organize when to build things, when to break down damaged structures, many other processes too. But if all cells in your body tries to do everything all at once, repair themselves, build themselves, clear out waste and so on, that frankly would just be too energetically taxing. It wouldn't be something that cells could sustain. And so we need that type of temporal segregation in order to actually achieve the different things that all these different tissues need to do each day.
Yeah, you touch on obviously the process of entrainment there, and like I guess things that we can actually do, like behaviors that we can act on to help us to shift our kind of body clock forward if that's need be. But I also think with the fact that you mentioned in regards to the difference between coping with just like having to accept that maybe if you do a shift schedule, you maybe do like one night every 4 weeks or something like that, there's not a huge point in really kind of like changing any type of routines and maybe just kind of getting on with it. But then again, the conduciveness of the time, the location or the job role that you might be in for the likes of the fixed night shifts. But I guess like some things that I am not too certain on, or I know that we don't have conscious control over, is things like overnight when we're generally sleeping, like we might have like certain hormones released that could be like conducive towards building muscle, recovery, gaining strength. Like so, there's obviously like the likes of like testosterone, there's likes of IGF-1. How is like the release of those hormones impacted through night shifts? Like, would it be the same when the person gets home after a night shift and has their sleep during the day? Does that release still take place, or what goes on with these other rhythms that we don't really have full conscious control over?
So just to spell out a couple of those rhythms that you're referring to, if you look, for example, at testosterone, which is of course very anabolic in skeletal muscle specifically, then what you should see in someone who is not working a shift and they're well entrained to the light dark cycle is that around the time that they awake in the morning, there is the sharp spike in testosterone synthesis. And this is part of the reason why it's important to standardize the time of day at which you get blood tests. there are some hormones that have quite a big amplitude, and much of that is driven by the circadian clock. So just bear that in mind. If you ever get blood tests for things like testosterone, then standardizing your fed status, so you should do this fasted, time of day of the sample collection, so on, does matter. You mentioned IGF-1 there as well, and growth hormone is also strongly driven by the circadian clock. And with growth hormone, you tend to see large spikes in synthesis during sleep, certain stages of sleep in particular. Growth hormone is interesting because you actually have a series of small spikes in synthesis that are superimposed over a general trend. I won't go into that, but we actually have rhythms across different timescales. We have roughly 24-hour rhythms or circadian rhythms, but you also have ultradian rhythms, which occur over much shorter time spans, and infradian rhythms that occur over longer ones. And the only one of those that's really well documented in humans is the menstrual cycle in women. So just bear that in mind. But in the case of growth hormone, we produce much of our 24-hour growth hormone during the nighttime when we are asleep. And that is somewhat under circadian control too. And so if we're well rested and our clocks are aligned, we'll quite predictably see those spikes in production at roughly those times of day. But of course, in the case of shift work, the problem is that there's typically some sort of misalignment in the circadian system. And so it might be that the central clock in the brain is set to one time, but the clock in the liver is set to another time, and the clock in the adipose tissue is set to another time. Skeletal muscle is another time. And therefore, you tend to see some disorganization of some of these rhythms. And for that reason, it's actually very hard to say in shift work, we see this change in the phase relationships between the different hormones, because it's entirely context dependent. The other thing is that in the case of shift work, the way that it's studied can be split in a few different ways. So one way that it might be studied is looking at populations of shift workers and then looking at the hormonal rhythms of those individuals and seeing how they compare to people that aren't working shifts. And that's fine, but again, we'll see large inconsistencies from study to study depending on the specifics of the shifts that they're working and so on. Another way that people study shift works is to try and simulate them. And these types of studies aren't particularly ecologically valid. They don't really represent the types of lives that shift workers have. And what they tend to show is that if we, for example, change the behavioral cycle and mimic shift work by enforcing, for example, light-dark cycles and cycles of food availability that someone's clock can't fully adjust to, because your clock can only adjust at a certain speed. So if you try to ask it to adjust too fast, it won't go far. It will basically say, I can't make that big jump, so I'm actually going to stay roughly where I am instead. And so this is often modeled using an experimental paradigm called forced desynchrony, where you might, for example, impose a 28-hour day onto someone. And so after 3 of those 28-hour days, the person is now awake and eating 12 hours out of line with where they began. And so there's this complete mismatch between their behavioral cycle and their circadian cycle. And then we can try and understand, well, what are some of the changes that take place? How do they respond to food differently? How do their hormones look different in terms of the rhythms of those hormones and so on? And in general, we do see changes in certain rhythms. So often the cortisol rhythm, for example, cortisol being this important stress hormone, it's got various different functions it's involved in, immune function and other processes too, tends to be out of whack. But some other hormones, they might not budge quite as much. And something to mention is just that it's likely that different clocks in the body can shift over at different paces. And you might have experienced this firsthand if, for example, you have jet lag. Let's say that you fly from the UK or from Spain to the west coast of the US. It's roughly an 8-hour time zone difference depending on where you are. You might find that after a couple of days of being in the US, if you fully switched your food timing over to the new time zone, then the gastrointestinal disturbances, maybe you just had some bloating and some gas and maybe you're a bit constipated at the start, maybe after just a couple of days, those symptoms largely subside. and you feel like those clocks are actually pretty much on time with the new time zone, but your sleep is still all over the place. And that's because it's a little different depending on the person, whether they're a morning lark or a night owl, and whether you're going east or west. But generally speaking, the clock in the brain typically only adapts at a rate of about 1 time zone per day. So if you're flying across 8 time zones, it might take you about 8 days to fully shift it over, and therefore to fully shift your sleep over too. Meanwhile, your digestive system by day 8 has been on time with the new time zone for the previous 6 days. So I'm not really answering your question, but what I'm trying to get at is just that it's very context dependent. The clocks adjust at different rates, and so it really comes down to what the individual is trying to do in terms of adapting fully to the new schedule or not, and then understanding what some of the changes are that take place in their body at this time when their clocks are being pushed around, in order that they can cope with it as best as possible. So I'll pause there again.
Yeah, no, like it does make sense, right? Because I guess it's not, there's plenty of people who do shift work and they might not have that side of their schedule, like, you know, optimized, right? They might not have like their sleeping schedule optimized, but they could have all their ducks in a row when it comes to their nutrition, or they have all their ducks in a row when it comes to training. You know, even they might be really good at like managing stress. And I guess it kind of speaks to the fact that, you know, while obviously the sleep and optimizing that does play a role in, like, you know, improving outcomes for training and like helping with, like, you know, improving the likes of testosterone function and stuff like that, it's not as if this side of your life is deficient, you are like, fucked. You know?
Yeah.
It speaks to, like, you know, there's plenty of things here that are impacting us, and it makes sense because we're a complex biological system that, like, you know, like, again, as I said, there's many different clocks, like, in all these different areas, which most people wouldn't even kind of think of, you know, that are kind of governing how we're going to be performing or how our body's adapting to a certain training stimulus.
Yeah, and all these different tissues, they're sending signals to each other.
Yeah.
And I think what you mentioned there is important. One way to visualize this is to imagine the different elements of lifestyle as being a bit like legs of a stool. So if you had 10 legs on a stool, if you removed one of those legs, the stool would be more likely to buckle under weight, but it would stay standing. And so a lot of people, they'll go through some period where sleep temporarily is just decimated. Maybe they just had a kid, maybe they're starting a really difficult shift, and so on. And if they can keep the other legs of the stool in place, they can carry on training appropriately. They understand that their ability to make good health behavior decisions will be compromised because they're less well rested, and therefore they're more likely to give in to smaller, sooner rewards than they would otherwise be. So if they set up their environment so that it's easy to make good food choices at that time, all of those things will help buffer against the effects of the sleep disruption. A lot of people can actually do that very effectively, and there's been some really nice research in recent years looking at the effects of things like high intensity intermittent training on how people respond to insufficient sleep, showing that if people undergo intermittent cycling sprints when they have several nights of sleep restriction, the intermittent exercise largely offsets the effects of the sleep restriction on things like muscle protein synthesis, on proxies of the body clock. So they typically look at the temperature cycles at the wrist, because your body temperature has fluctuations each day. A lot of people know that body temperature in the core is highest around the end of the afternoon and typically lowest during the sleep period, but the skin is actually antiphasic to that. The skin has the opposite pattern to what's going on in the core. And so actually just measuring your temperature, say at your wrist or wherever on the skin, can tell you something about where your clock is, and in particular the clock in the brain, the central clock. But that type of exercise during insufficient sleep, it also offsets the negative effects on things like blood sugar control, possibly on mitochondrial function too. So it has all these different beneficial effects that can largely nullify the effects of the sleep disruption. So we just need to bear that in mind and recognize that occasionally things go wrong and maybe one or two legs of the stool become dramatically compromised. But if we can try and keep the others in place, then we'll be in a much better position to cope with that.
Yeah, training seems to be one of those like entrainment kind of methods, you could say, that like a lot of my clients like definitely swear by. Like once their training is in a consistent schedule and like, you know, they're they're trying to keep it around a kind of similar time, like most days, even when they're rotating between shift work. They seem to have better quality sleep during the day, and they have easier time like adapting to their night schedule. And even if anybody who's listening to this has ever done like one of those long haul flights which you're talking about, where you travel over to like the west coast of America, like I lived in Canada there for a year, and any time I fly from Dublin to Toronto, once I got off the plane, as much as I hated to do it, I'd go to the gym, and I felt like just getting a workout in, despite it being like probably like 12 o'clock like Irish time, like 12 o'clock at night Irish time, it did kind of set me up well for a good night's sleep that night, and then like even into the next day being able to get a little bit closer to being on track. I think it's and I've heard like even Eric Helms talk about that, like when anytime he travels abroad, and he seems to do a lot because he lives in New Zealand. Anytime he gets off the plane, he just goes out off, hits up a training session. That helps him too, so there must be something to it.
It can be helpful. It can be both helpful or harmful depending on the time of training. And so what I would say is that generally speaking, speaking about the body's clockwork as a whole, tends to respond very similarly to training timing to the way that it responds to light exposure. So what I was saying earlier about how bright light late in the day or in the early sleep period tends to push your clock later, whereas light at the very start of the day, for about 2 hours before you naturally wake in the morning to a couple of hours after, that tends to speed you up and shift you earlier. The same is likely true of training based on the limited research done so far. The best research, and that's probably been done by Sean Youngstead, who is looking at treadmill exercise, but the same is likely true of resistance training. There's every reason to think that that's the case. So when it comes to shifting to a new time zone or adapting to a new schedule, if you're using something that tells you when to expose yourself to light, that's probably generally the best time to exercise too, if you're trying to further shift your clocks. And in terms of those schedules, when to experience bright light, when to avoid it, for jet lag, there's a great app called
Jet Lag Rooster
by Time Shifter. Well, there's Jet Lag Rooster, but Jet Lag Rooster is a freely available web app, and it's great for a free product, but it's not as effective in my experience as Time Shifter, which is paid, but you get the first flight for free and you get a plan. And the company Time Shifter that makes the jet lag app, they recently made an app for shift workers too, which I think is creatively called the Shift Work app. And so that will give you personalized recommendations about when to see bright light, when to avoid it, and so on. And with physical activity, the point I'm trying to emphasize is just that if you coincide your training with when it's telling you to see bright light, that is going to help you shift in the direction that you want to shift at a faster rate. So you can definitely use exercise to speed your entrainment to the new time zone or to the new schedule. And generally speaking, exercising hard late in the biological day is going to delay your clock. Exercising hard early in the biological day is going to advance your clock.
Okay. Yeah. I will make sure to link that app in the description too, because I'm sure some people will find that very useful. I guess like one thing I want us to touch on as well, as we go through all these different processes, is digestion, and like digestion overnight. Because like one thing I've heard from many shift work clients is like when they try to eat overnight, they don't feel too good, they feel quite bloated. I have an idea what's going on here, but I'll let you to kind of take away and try to explain this phenomenon.
So I think an important overarching point, which you alluded to earlier, is that in the context of shift work, bearing in mind that a lot of people work rotating shifts specifically, and it's rare that someone is trying to exclusively work nights, week in and week out. In most instances, people's clocks don't fully adjust to the new schedule, and they actually stay somewhat stuck in whatever their original schedule was. And so their clocks are actually relatively similar to the rest of the population in terms of their timing a lot of the time. And the research that's been done to date actually therefore suggests that if you can try and maintain your eating schedule at a relatively similar time to what it would otherwise be if you were just working days, then that is likely a good thing for you metabolically. And the best work on this in my mind, has been done by Frank Shear, and they did this lovely work recently that was using that type of experimental circadian misalignment that I mentioned earlier. And they basically either had people maintain their meal timing as if they were just day workers, like most people, or they shifted their meal timing. And they also measured the timing of the master clock in the brain at this time, or a proxy of the master clock in the brain. And what they found was that when people maintained the day-like eating schedule, their blood sugar control was much better. And then when they subsequently looked at the timing of the master clock in the brain, they found that its timing really hadn't budged that much. And so it seems that keeping a relatively normal meal schedule was actually helping to align the different clocks in the body, because the master clock in the brain influences all sorts of processes, and one of the ultimate outputs of it is that it relays information to the pineal gland that synthesizes melatonin. And melatonin basically acts as an internal signal of darkness, telling cells throughout your body to engage in appropriate activities for the dark period. And one of the tissues that signals to is the pancreas. And melatonin inhibits glucose-stimulated insulin secretion by the pancreas. So in general, when melatonin is high, the pancreas has to crank out a lot more insulin to dispose of the glucose effectively. And that might be part of the reason why their blood sugar was much worse, because the pancreas basically isn't working as well at that time of day. So they did a follow-up study that was very interesting, where they looked at a bunch of different cardiovascular health markers. They looked at things like a clotting factor and heart rate variability and some other things too. And they found very similar relationships there, namely that the different measures of cardiovascular risk were improved by maintaining that day-like meal schedule. So what I'd say is that in general, if you're working rotating shifts, you want to try and maintain as consistent an eating window from day to day as possible. And then if for whatever reason you have to eat outside of that window, then I would basically try and make it a relatively small, relatively easy to digest snack that's not going to bump your blood sugar much, that's going to support muscle protein balance if you're interested in physique training. And so that might look like a relatively low carbohydrate, lowish fat snack with a bolus of an easy to digest complete protein and a small amount of fiber too. So it could be something like a protein shake, a few nuts and a piece of fruit. Or if you have a favorite protein bar and you really crave something sweet, and the protein bar isn't absolutely loaded with fiber, which is going to wreck your tummy at that time of day, then something like that might be a good option. But keep it small and high in protein, and that's probably going to serve you relatively well. And what I was saying about consistency from day to day also goes for sleep. So the big issue that shift workers are disposed to when it comes to circadian rhythms and sleep is called shift work disorder. It affects roughly a quarter of shift workers, and it's characterized by being really tired and struggling to function when you have to be awake. And then when you finally get the chance to sleep, you sleep badly and you have insomnia-like symptoms. You find it hard to initiate sleep and stay asleep because your clock is promoting wakefulness at that time. So you might have loads of sleep pressure, but it's still hard to fall asleep and stay asleep. And so bearing that in mind, in the case of shift work disorder, you're trying to keep as consistent a sleep schedule as possible, which is aligned with where the master clock in your brain is, which is probably going to be closer to a day-like shift pattern than you might realize. And then outside of that, you might, similar to the way that you might snack outside of that, you might nap opportunistically and use those in particular when there's an onus on being safe. Shift workers are disposed to many different health issues. They've got a high risk of coronary heart disease. The list goes on and on. I don't want to go into that, in part because I don't want to make people scared and concerned unnecessarily. But one of the things they are disposed to too is accidents. And that's simply because they're more sleepy and their brain function is therefore more compromised. And so bearing that in mind, if you are very sleepy and say you've got to drive home from your workplace or what have you, then it makes sense to sometimes stop and have a nap and then give yourself some time after the nap in which to wake up and to get rid of the sleep inertia, which is the process that gives rise to that groggy feeling that temporarily can impair brain function. And so if you wanted a short-term boost in alertness, then about 20 minutes of actual sleep, so you might give yourself a 25-minute sleep opportunity because you might need 5 minutes to fall asleep, is going to work well. If you wanted a longer-term boost in your alertness, as well as some restorative effects on other body systems like your cardiovascular system, your immune system, then having a nap that contains roughly 90 minutes of actual sleep. So maybe that's an hour and 40-minute opportunity, because again, you're going to take a little bit of time to fall asleep, is likely to work well. But with that longer nap, you're going to have more sleep inertia. So you're going to need a bit more time straight after the nap for the grogginess to go away before returning to whatever you want to do. Because if you try to drive off straight away after a 90-minute nap, you might be quite compromised just for half an hour or so. You can also add to the effects of those naps on alertness by having a small amount of caffeine shortly before, a so-called nappuccino or a caffeine nap. And in the research, a lot of this has been done by Jim Horn. They've actually used quite large doses of caffeine immediately before the nap, often roughly 200 milligrams of caffeine, which is about what you'd get from 1.5 flat whites or Americanos or lattes in a good coffee shop. It's about the amount that's in 4 instant coffees of a reasonable size, or 4 cups of tea of a similar size. So that's quite a lot, but I wouldn't necessarily advise that, because the more caffeine you consume, the more likely it is to encroach on your subsequent main sleep opportunity. And we want to protect that. The nice thing about that, though, is that going by work from other people like David Dinges, smaller, more regular boluses of caffeine seem to be better for maintaining performance during wakefulness than having larger boluses less frequently. And so having something like 50 milligrams of caffeine, so about what you get from a cup of tea, or less than a single shot of espresso, is going to give you a bit of a boost after the nap if you have that immediately before the nap, but it's not going to have a dramatic effect, and it's less likely to encroach on your subsequent sleep opportunity. So when it comes to using caffeine to counter that sleep process that I was discussing at the start, less caffeine more frequently is better than more caffeine less frequently. And while for the general population, I typically say something like try and finish your caffeine consumption by at least 9 hours before your main sleep opportunity. For shift work, bearing safety in mind, we can probably be a little bit more flexible with that and say something more like 6 hours before the main sleep opportunity. Bearing in mind there are huge differences between people and how they metabolize caffeine. That relates to all sorts of factors, including genetics and the function of someone's liver based on the amount of fat that's in it and so on. So the big picture, to try and summarize what I was just saying, is that regularity is really important. And that's true of both meal timing and sleep. And that's also true when you're working through a rotating schedule. Then otherwise, if you're really hungry, then a small snack that's not going to disturb your blood sugar and blood lipids too much is probably the way to go. So it's going to be mostly based on protein and a small amount of fiber. With respect to sleep, a brief nap with a bit of time after the nap in order to wake back up is going to serve you really well.
Yeah, the regularity during the day with the meal frequency has definitely been something I've been shifting a lot of clients to. And I guess like when you kind of mention that initially to people who are probably used to eating overnight for a long period of time, they're like, oh, I don't know, fasting, just not eating for 7-8 hours, don't know how I feel about that. But I find once a lot of people make the shift over, they notice that they can just go that time without food. Like they're happy to just have water, maybe like a Coke Zero or something like that, or a small coffee, as you mentioned there, just to kind of get them through. Because even I don't work shift work, but anytime I've had to stay up extremely late past a certain time, there's just no appetite there, and I think it also is important to kind of note that depending on your diet composition, that's going to also affect what your kind of hunger signaling is like at that time. Like if you during the day in your regular diet is like a lot of hyper processed food, high sugar food, things that are just extremely tasty, you're probably gonna feel hungry no matter what time of day it is, never mind like overnights. But I would assume, like, you probably don't have like a recommended food list here for shift workers, but because I would assume it would be similar to what you'd advise anybody who's looking to improve their health, right? Something that is probably going to be regularly high in proteins, something that is going to be a relatively high fiber diet, mostly whole foods, getting in a kind of good balance of polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, some saturated fat, but not having too much, whole grain carbs, plenty of fruit and vegetables, that kind of thing, right? Just like eating a whole food, health oriented diet, right? So if you're kind of like moving towards that in your regular diet, if you were to just keep that the same on the days where you're working shift work and just, again, keep to your regular pattern, as Greg said, that is probably something that is going to serve you overnight. And as well, it's going to have the benefit that, like, if you're paying attention to your diet in that aspect through like nutritional density, you're going to have all of like the micronutrients there in place too, which could be playing a role in supporting the sleep when you are going to get it, as well as supporting your energy through the night shifts,
Yeah, I'll just pick up on a couple of things there. One is that you were speaking about how people might initially feel hungry. I spoke earlier about entrainment. So trying to align the entire circadian system with the world around you. People will notice that they get hungry at very predictable times of day that coincide with meal times. And that's because you actually entrain your hunger too. And so some of the hormones that acutely promote hunger, like ghrelin, have these pulses at certain times of day, which are trained by your meal patterns. And so a lot of people, they have to go through a couple of days initially when they've made changes to their meal timing, where they might be hungry at times where previously they've been eating. But once they're through that and they've entrained some of the clocks in the gut to those new times, then they'll no longer be hungry at those previous times, and they will have adjusted to their new schedule. Something else that people might consider is that if they're trying to keep that type of daytime eating schedule, but they occasionally have to work night shifts, they can tinker with the composition of the final meal of the eating schedule each day. For example, if someone's going to be up for 8 hours after their final meal, then they could increase the size of that meal. And they could focus on particularly satiating foods. Per calorie, protein is more satiating than carbohydrate or fat. Fiber is very satiating, while practically not adding any calories to your intake. And so ensuring there's plenty of protein and fiber in it, but also maybe adding some fat and some carbohydrate to it is going to be helpful. And then what you were saying about how fundamentally shift workers need to eat similarly in terms of diet composition to non-shift workers, I completely agree with. If there is a difference, then it's probably quite minor, and I'd say that it obviously relates to meal timing primarily, but also because someone is experiencing this type of regular circadian and sleep disruption, there's probably an argument to be made for paying particular attention to blood sugar control, and that might take the form of consuming a slightly lower carbohydrate diet, slightly, I don't mean dramatic difference, or just paying more attention to the glycemic loads of different meals. And so, for example, choosing slightly lower glycemic load foods. So rather than having white rice as a starch source at a meal, someone might go for the same amount of carbs from sweet potato because it has a lower glycemic index or glycemic load, just as one example. So I think there's some sense to that. And interestingly, there is actually some work now looking at people in the context of sleep disruption and tinkering with different macronutrient profiles, suggesting that a very low carbohydrate diet during sleep disruption might be better at alleviating sleepiness and maintaining some cognitive functions during sleep deprivation. Some of that has been in military personnel and funded by the military because they're trying to understand how do we help people better cope with sleep deprivation when they're on the front lines. But in terms of performance, that's not necessarily going to be most conducive to performing well in the gym, because we can put the low carb acolytes and the keto nuts to the side. Carbohydrate is really important for exercise performance if you're doing high intensity exercise like lifting weights. So carbohydrate matters. I'm just saying that you could consider using slightly less carbohydrate in your diet than you otherwise would, or otherwise just being a little bit more meticulous about the sources.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that would be offset by like consuming a little bit more fiber, or even like having a little bit more fats in those meals. Also, the same way that you mentioned that the person who is has a 8 hour shift ahead and they could have a larger meal. The same goes with the people who are coming in from the shift work and they want to keep to a morning meal, having a smaller morning meal before they go to sleep, because obviously the size of a meal before you go to sleep can really kind of offset like your ability to fall asleep. So having something small when you get in, could be one of those protein boluses, could be something like a bowl of Greek yogurt, some bit of fruit, bit of nuts, as you're kind of saying, something like that, something that's going to be easy, not going to sit in your stomach too long, but you're going to be kind of kick-starting like one of those like MPS doses for the start of the day. Then, you know, maybe start having your carbohydrates later in the day once you wake up around your training window, for example. I think that would be something that could work quite well.
Yeah, and one more thought about the total macronutrition of someone's diet is that a lot of people working rotating shifts or permanent night shifts, frankly, aren't going to recover quite as well from exercise because their sleep isn't as restorative and their clocks are misaligned. And so I don't think that very aggressive periods of weight gain are particularly smart for most people. So I would say that shift workers during their phases where they're trying to put on some muscle might be slightly less aggressive with the rate at which they're trying to gain weight than non-shift workers. And also related to that, I'd argue that maybe their training volumes should be marginally lower too, because if they push their training too hard, and especially if they're using programs where they're going through overreaching phases, for instance, they're not going to recover as well, and they're more likely to pick up infections like upper respiratory tract infections, and maybe they're more likely to pick up niggles too, musculoskeletal issues. That isn't really borne out by the research, but that to me is mostly a function of the limitations of the research, namely that training studies are hard to do and they tend to be quite short term because they're expensive. And so most training studies where people are undergoing some form of sleep disruption are a few days long, frankly. One of the best studies on this came out not that long ago, and it was looking at healthy young women with intact menstrual cycles, and they just looked at the effects of a few nights of insufficient sleep versus a few nights of regular sleep on their training performance during several resistance training sessions. And they basically found that when they weren't sleeping enough, their session ratings of perceived exertion, RPEs, were substantially higher. They also had much larger cortisol responses, so the cortisol area under the curve, the total amount of cortisol that they were producing was substantially higher. And then their average lifting velocities during lower body multi-joint exercises like squats were lower as well. So they're moving the bar more slowly. And all of that suggests to me that those people are going to adapt less well to the exercise. But when we're only talking about 3 or 4 resistance training sessions, we can't tell. And we also don't know anything about injuries. We just know that clearly those sessions were a lot more stressful for those women. And I think that means that they're probably more likely to either struggle with motivation, to pick up niggles, or to end up with some sort of infection.
It makes sense to a degree. Like your stress tolerance bucket essentially gets smaller. The less sleep you have, the less recovery you are. And again, you mentioned something there that's really important, like the motivational aspect. You know, geez, even on days where you're well slept, you come into the gym and you're like, oh, fuck this. But then on days when you're actually tired and you've come off the back of like a number of nights, you know, you might not have the same drive. And, you know, when motivation is there, like you could lack focus. And if you're doing like big barbell lifts, like for like a power lifter, for example, they're peaking into a competition, they're coming up to like an important kind of, like single that they have to do. You know, they lack attention for a split second at any point, they could end up like hurting themselves, you know. And then what happens after that? It's like, okay, well, you still have to go back to work. So now the recovery process gets even more stretched out. So I guess that's probably something I was going to ask you, is like, when it does come to like these like competition periods, so say for example powerlifting, typically coming into like a peak before competition, somebody's going to be having their training intensity is going to be at the highest point, their volume is going to be starting to like taper down, they're essentially going to be, most people are going to be running anywhere between like single to triples on like 85 to 95% of their 1 rep max, right? Could we essentially look at like toggling this person's either recovery to allow them to have the best training outcomes on this day, during weeks like this, coming into a competition? Because of course, if somebody's doing rotating shift work, they're already on a little bit of a back foot.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm sorry for the vague answer, but I think you have to take it on a case by case basis. But there are probably a few things that we can pull out that are practical too. For example, someone's sessions over the course of the week are going to differ in how demanding they are. And so you might look at your microcycle, which typically for someone is just going to be a training week, and identify the sessions that are most important and most likely to cause issues. Being frank, if someone's short on sleep and they're trying to lift heavy singles and they're deep into a training period, then you've got to be careful and you've got to be smart. Those sessions you should try and schedule for when you're best rested. And therefore, if you're working shifts and you know what your schedule is in advance, then think about where you position those particular sessions. So you might just need to shuffle around your training week a little bit and approach things that way. There's also the element of auto-regulation, so adjusting your training on the fly. And this is a really interesting subject, and it's not something that I frankly spent that much time looking at for probably 11 years. I worked as a sprints coach when I was doing my undergrad and my master's, so I used to work with university level sprinters, and therefore was very interested in training periodization and auto-regulation, a bunch of adjacent subjects too back then. But now the work that I do is a lot broader than that, so I need to understand many more things than I used to be able to understand. But with auto-regulation, I think that you can consider the long term and the importance of just staying healthy at this time. And therefore, if you are working shifts, I would err on the side of being conservative. And I also think it would be really helpful to have someone in your corner helping you out with your training program or just training decisions generally. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a coach, but a soundboard, someone that knows their stuff to bounce ideas on when you could go one of two ways. You're not sure whether to keep the session as it is or whether to adjust it. My suggestion is that in general, I think you should err on the side of caution. I've never worked shifts apart from briefly working in a bar when I was at university in my first year. And I was a terrible shift worker. I really didn't adapt to it very well at all. But I know what it's like to experience circadian disruption and sleep loss, because I frankly experience a lot more jet lag than most people do. And I bounce around a lot, I travel a lot, and therefore I'm often sleeping in different places. And if I think back to the last 5 or 10 minor musculoskeletal issues that I've had, I would guess that 3/4 of them have been when I've been poorly rested. Whatever it might be, maybe it's doing box jumps and then I forget to put the box up against the wall and the box slips from under me and then I land on my wrist, and then I think if I just fracture my wrist, and I'm not sure, but there's definitely some damage there. I was doing box jumps recently when I was tired, and it was a bizarre injury, and it wasn't a proper injury. But as I landed, my right foot just scuffed a little bit and it forced my lower leg into external rotation. And I saw a physio about it a couple of days later, and I probably had a very minor patellar tendon tear, just going by the symptoms and various orthopedic tests. So it's just an example of how doing an exercise, which you always think of as being quite benign and quite safe, when you are tired and you go ahead with it anyway, things are more likely to go wrong. I also know that when I'm really, really tired, I make worse training decisions.
Yeah.
So maybe I think, I've got that much that's scheduled on this lift, and so I want to maintain that intensity. Or I might be a bit tired, but I'm still going to add 2.5 kilos to the bar or whatever. And I know that if I was well rested and I was looking on, I'd be like, you're just being an idiot. Like you should actually probably marginally reduce the intensity of that. The same thing if something happens in training, maybe something doesn't quite feel right. Like I was doing trap bar deadlifts the other day, and the area around the long head, the origin of the long head of my left tricep started playing up, and I thought, I'm not quite sure what that is, but it's not quite right. And it's one of those things where during the training session you think this could go one of two ways. This could either become a proper injury, or I could back off and leave it alone, see how it feels tomorrow. And I'm smart enough to do that, but I know that when I'm short on sleep, I'm more likely to go ahead with it and ignore it. So be conservative. It's a good thing if you've got someone in your corner. Try and schedule the hard stuff for when you're better rested. That involves a lot of forethought. So I just say that planning is really important. And then in terms of recovery from exercise, a lot of that comes down to nutrition and trying to set up your sleep environment to sleep well. Because if you think about sleep for shift workers, and they're often trying to sleep in environments that are less conducive to sleep than the rest of us, because maybe they're trying to sleep during the day and it's noisier outside than it is at night, and it's hotter as well, which is going to interfere with their sleep, and there's more light coming in through the curtains, and so they have to navigate all of that as well. And therefore I think trying to set up your sleep environment to make it a little sleep chamber that is going to help you sleep during the day as well, if you have to, is really important. So that could just entail making sure that you've got a good sleep mask and you've got a fan to cool you down. And maybe, whereas usually you wouldn't use them, occasionally you use some silicone earplugs to cancel some of the noise around you. All of that can meaningfully affect your recovery over the long term, and can also potentially help you make better training decisions to avoid those types of niggles that I was just speaking about.
Yeah, I think the auto regulation during those periods are just for like it's helpful for everybody, but it's especially helpful for people who are doing the likes of shift work, because like one thing that I will give clients is like, you know, maybe an RPE range to kind of to be within, you know, or like a loading range that I'd like us to be within. Like if you're feeling really, really good, we'll aim towards the top end. If you come in, all your warm-ups are feeling pretty crappy, go towards the low end. Because I think like assessing readiness on a day-to-day basis for a training perspective is probably easiest done when you're actually in the midst of the training session, like when you're going through your warm-ups, because there's some days where you feel quite tired and you end up warming up and you hit a PB, you know, whereas so that's kind of like how I kind of get people to do it. But then also, as you said there at the beginning, you know, identifying what the most important work within a training week is to get done, and what would be like an acceptable week of work, what would be the bare minimum that we essentially need to accomplish by the end of the week, and how we can essentially work that around your shift. So again, if you come off the back of a few nights and you feel wrecked, you don't feel like that would be a good day to hit like your last heavy squat or prep, just move it out a day. It's like people can get in their mind, get in their head and say, oh, well, now that's like one day closer to the competition than it would have been. Like usually maybe that exposure time, it makes a difference. But it's like, well, if you do it on the day after your shift or the day of your shift, maybe that wouldn't have yielded the best performance or your ability to kind of express like what you're actually capable of on that day, and also could increase the risk of injury. Whereas if we have it the day forward, where you're able to be a bit more better rested, better hydrated, better fed, that reduces the risk of that. Obviously, the risk is always there, but it may yield a better outcome on the day. And it could be the difference between somebody rolling into a competition, feeling very, very confident in themselves and confident in their abilities, and having better data overall, or, you know, the complete opposite of all of that. And then you're trying to console somebody going into a meet.
Yeah, well said. And also going back to auto-regulation, think that RPE is probably the best gauge to use for most people in this context. Because if you think about some other markers that people might use to try and auto-regulate their training, which aren't widely used by the types of people that might be listening to this, they're not particularly widely used by strength athletes. Maybe that's changing a bit over time, but I'd say that it's still largely true. But things like looking at heart rate variability and maybe some measures of explosive strength, so vertical jump performance is one that's used a lot in a sporting context, that type of thing, they're not that widely used. But if you think about heart rate variability just as an example, then it's under strong circadian modulation too. And so if you're going to think, well, I want to measure my HRV today and therefore use that to inform what I should do with my training, then there's a good chance, if you're working shifts, that the circadian time of day that you're measuring your heart rate variability from day to day isn't consistent. And so there's going to be a lot of noise there anyway. And it's harder for that reason to actually use that information to intelligently inform your training. Whereas how well rested you feel going into the session, how you feel during warm-ups, that I think is likely a more practical guide as to what you should do. And from a coaching perspective, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think that we've got to bear in mind recovery capacity, but also injury risk here. And so if I was a coach and I was working with someone going into a powerlifting meet, and I had two clients and one of them was a well-rested person that didn't work shifts and the other was a shift worker, then if we imagine they're identical twins with identical training history, then they would be on different programs. And I would probably give the shift worker a slightly lower volume training. The relative intensities might be quite similar during that taper, but the shift worker would probably be doing fewer reps. So the RPE would be higher, and they'd be focusing more on bar speed and be a little further from failure, and that way they'd be less likely to get injured. It might be that the relative intensity was a tiny bit lower for the shift worker, but it wouldn't be dramatically different. And again, we have to bear in mind in the context of strength training that one of the things we're really interested in is motor unit recruitment. Motor units just being the nerve fibers and skeletal muscles that they innervate. And recruitment proceeds in a largely orderly fashion. So you start with the slowest muscle fibers and then the intermediate ones and then the fastest ones. And that's typically how it works if you were doing, for example, relatively high rep bodybuilding style training. But with power training, you can override that principle of orderly recruitment if you intend to move quickly during an exercise. And so actually you can recruit all of those muscle fibers at lighter loads, provided that you're trying to move the bar as quickly as possible. And so I'd maybe think about trying to provide that type of stimulus in a slightly different way, with the focus really, really being on bar speed, assuming that someone could do that in a safe way, obviously, and using slightly lower volumes for the shift worker during that taper. It's not to say that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise reach some of the same training intensities that the non-shift worker would reach at certain points in their training. They probably would. But you just have to... You have an additional variable to account for within your training periodization, and that is the shift schedule.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned there in regards to the, I guess you could say velocity training. Just trying to move the bar fast, because that's something that I would program like into tapers, but then also you just like regular training weeks for for most powerlifting clients, they'll have like one day where the kind of sole focus is essentially getting a lighter load, moving the bar fast, or we could even do that on the likes of back downs after likes of a top set. And it typically does allow them to, over time, get used to that kind of recruitment of those kind of bigger motor units, but also just keeping their technique solid over time as well. But yeah, that's definitely something that could be very, very beneficial for anybody who's like coming tapering into a meet. It's also interesting that you're kind of mentioned there with, fuck's sake, I'm after it started to slip out my mind there slightly. But I was actually just thinking when you're talking about a powerlifter like slightly having their performance offset, and think about like how jet lag affects like powerlifters when they go from the States over to like maybe Worlds, which most of the time is going to be in Europe or like South Africa. And I quite often see like the US team, they quite often have bit high hopes, but then they underperform. And obviously there is an element of probably the jet lag and the sleep offset potentially affecting them through the travel. Like,
yeah, it's not just that. It's actually also related to the timing of their clocks and the time of day at which they have to perform relative to their circadian system. And this raises an important point. So there's been quite a lot of research on this in the US, looking at teams in certain sports. So you can look at basketball players, for example, and how they perform according to whether they're traveling east to west or west to east. And there's a big difference. And it's because in one instance, they're probably going in a direction that helps them perform closer to the time of day at which their body's clocks are promoting their best athletic performance. Whereas in the other direction, the reverse is true. And the main point that people need to take away here is that going into a powerlifting meet, you want to be training at the time of day at which you're going to compete, because that way you're basically telling the clocks in your skeletal muscles and your bones and so on, the tissues that are really important to lifting the weight, that this is when you can expect hard exercise. This is when you're going to have to lift something really heavy. It's at this time of day. So the timing of the training session matters too. And in the case of people struggling if they're going east or west, if say they're going east and they're having to perform at a substantially earlier circadian phase, they're probably going to struggle. Bear in mind what I said early on, that typically we're strongest and most powerful in the late biological afternoon for someone with a relatively normal chronotype, so not someone who's very larkish or owlish. They're probably going to be strongest if you account for everything else. So let's just say that they're completely untrained. They're probably going to be strongest at about 6 to 7 p.m, roughly that time of day. And there's going to be a substantial amplitude in their performance comparing that versus when their core temperature is at its lowest, let's say the early biological morning. And It's less true if you regularly train in the morning because your clocks are now expecting exercise at that time of day. So again, the main point is you need to train when you plan to compete going in. It doesn't have to be the whole time, but I'd suggest that certainly in the last 5 to 7 days, you need to be training at that time of day. And if that means that you're going to fly out to the US late in the day, 2 days before your competition, and in the US you're going to be competing in the early afternoon, then when you're back in Europe for the 5 days or so before, you might be shifting your training times later and later in order to get your clocks ready to perform at that time of day.
Yeah, that's something I do see a lot of athletes do, whether it's competing internationally or even competing domestically. Something I've done myself, and it can be a little bit of a shift initially, especially like I'm so used to like training in the afternoon. It's just like a very, very nice time. I got all my work done. I don't have any work to do in the even time. Then I could just kind of relax. The odd time you'll get landed with a meet at 9 a.m. and that's when you're lifting on the platform, and you know, especially if that's on a Saturday or Sunday and you don't want to get out of bed at that time or earlier than that. It can be a tough one to adjust to, especially just adjusting to actually performing and like lifting maximally at that time. But probably similar to people who inevitably will wake up before work and go to the gym. It's just something you have to do initially before it gets better, right? You have to go through like a week or so of it before you start to have that, like those clocks start to shift, as you're kind of saying there. I was going to as well kind of like touch on or ask you about like doing weight cuts, and if a client, say for example, is working with me and I'm getting to do like a water load during a week for a competition, right? So we'll maybe do like 4 to 5 days of loading water intake, then we'll do 1 day where we strip it back, and then the day after, that's when the actual weigh-in for the competition will be. But this person is also doing rotating shift work. Now, generally when you are loading water, so you could be like loading up to 100 milligrams per kilogram, so that could get up to like 10 liters of water a day for a person, and then stripping all the way to like maybe like 1 liter to 1.5 on the final day. During this time, people are urinating a lot, right? So in the context of like, you know, maybe doing something like that, how would it be better to maybe do that loading portion during nighttime when the person is awake and then has the opportunity to pee? Or would it be better to like kind of do the loading during the day portion when they're maybe trying to sleep? Because it can be a bit of rigmarole, because they're going to be kind of affected by one or the other, because again, they might not have the opportunity to work to do the loading because they can't go to the toilet all that often.
I would actually take one step back and I'd ask about whether that strategy makes sense for a shift worker.
Yeah.
And I would probably consider a less extreme strategy. Because I know in the case of water loading, depending on the context we're speaking about, so we talk about fluid restriction for athletes that are trying to meet some sort of weight limit. Mixed martial artists or they're weightlifters or something like that, and they need to get down to 72 kilos to compete, and right now they're at 78 kilos. So if we put those people to the side and we're talking about fluid manipulation for physique competitors specifically, then not everyone will approach that with large changes in their hydration status. And there are people that compete very effectively that don't use that type of cyclical approach. And for someone like a shift worker, if you normally use that with your clients who don't work shifts, I would consider taking a different strategy. In part because of the sleep disruption, but also because they're under more stress in general. And I just think that you're toying with variables that you don't have to toy with to get a good result. And there are more things that could go wrong. And as you're alluding to, you could also quite dramatically affect someone's recovery capacity going in if, for example, suddenly they have to wait very frequently to pee.
Yeah.
And therefore that's going to affect their look, because we know, for example, that sleep loss can affect muscle glycogen storage. And so it seems that sleep loss in general tends to reduce muscle glycogen storage. And if that's the case, then I think there are reasons to think that by disrupting sleep, someone could end up with a worse look on the stage, because you're affecting that, and you want them to go and glycogen loaded and also looking relatively dry. And you might have some elaborate fluid manipulation strategy going in, but in that type of stress state, that they're just not going to be able to make the most of it, and they might not respond to it the way that you expect. So I'd say use a less extreme approach for those people by default, and then as you work with someone over time, you can start to tinker with some of this stuff. But I think my starting point with someone would be something that's less severe. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, as you started to answer, I was like, I framed that question completely wrong.
Have I misinterpreted it?
No, you didn't. I shouldn't have just spoke about just water cuts, because of course for making weight for a competition, you can cut water, you can manipulate fiber, you can manipulate carbohydrate, fat intake, you can manipulate gut volume. I don't know why I just went straight into just water. It's probably because I have it written here that I just said water straight off the bat. But I guess, like, you know, if you take anything from what Greg said there, if you are doing some type of shift work pattern like that, where you are doing rotating shift work, probably doing a water cut, probably not the best option. Because, like, as we were kind of saying there, if the person doesn't really have an opportunity to either go to the bathroom or, like, you know, down 10 litres of water across the day, and then as well could also have a higher risk of affecting performance, has a little bit more variability in regards to if it is going to work for that specific person in that specific context, then it is a more risky strategy. And obviously, you know, you're kind of mentioning as well about, like, the physique kind of competitions there too, like bodybuilding and stuff. And even, like, for somebody who is competing in bodybuilding, like, doing like a water low, water cut, especially as a natural competitor, is probably not something that would be too recommended anymore.
I was going to say, is that an approach that you use when you're working with people?
No.
Okay. Because I was pussyfooting around there a little bit, because I know there are still some people that take that approach.
No.
And I personally would see that as quite an archaic approach. I just don't think that's necessary. So if you're speaking about fluid manipulation for the sake of cutting weight, then I think fundamentally the strategy is going to be quite similar to day workers. But I would still say that you just have to bear in mind someone's stress bucket, to go back to your analogy. And if they've got a smaller stress bucket, then the approach I would use would be less aggressive. So let's say that with one person, they're trying to cut 6 kilos. For the shift worker, maybe that's more like 4 or 5 kilos instead. It's just not quite as severe manipulation.
Yeah. Well, with the powerlifters I have worked with to help them make weight while working shift work, usually if we use a water load and a water cut, that's dependent on what their work schedule looks like that week. Like, if it is allowing them to actually, like, if they maybe have taken a few days off work, like maybe like the 1 to 2 days before competition, where they're probably going to have like the highest amount of urination.
So just to be clear, you're using the water load to promote diuresis, and then you're suddenly restricting fluid to try and then capitalize on the diuresis to accelerate the rate of
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So going back to what I was originally saying, I think someone wouldn't necessarily respond to that quite the same way, and there's possibly a greater risk of someone just holding on to more water during the load, for example. There are just more things that could go wrong. People might not respond the way that you'd expect them to if you'd only worked with day workers otherwise. Yeah.
And even from a coaching perspective, I've found it quite difficult to collect data from, because there's always the issue of, like, well, when do I check my weight? Like, when do I check my morning weight, my night weight? There's all these kind of different kind of variables that play into it. Whereas, and then as well, just like the constant urination. So generally something like carb fat manipulation, fiber manipulation, gut cut, that typically works a little bit better, because they almost have to do less. Like, people are typically eating smaller portion sizes, more calorie dense options, and just typically leads to a more predictable result. But you did mention there in regards to likes of even peak weeks for bodybuilding competitions, which is slightly different, right? Like, of course, the person who is doing a water cut and they're getting on stage, they're probably going to look fairly flat, and that person is probably more so going to be looking to load carbohydrates. And there's different ways to load carbohydrates. There's like the front load, back load, and the kind of more kind of linear methods, which I would imagine kind of what we touched on earlier in the podcast where you're talking about like keeping the same regularity with your meal schedules. That'd be something that would be advisable. I don't
Yeah,
know.
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And that in part relates to how well someone disposes of glucose.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would probably approach that quite similarly to someone that was working day shifts. But again, just I suppose the general theme here is to maybe stay further from the extremes with these people.
Yeah.
And not make any drastic changes at the last minute. If you're glycogen loading, say, then I wouldn't necessarily expect absolutely plying someone with huge amounts of carbohydrate right at the last minute to work out well for someone. And a slightly more metered approach would probably work better.
Yeah, I can imagine with somebody who's a physique competitor, it'd probably be considering you're already going to know from the outset that they're going to have like this shift work component kind of filtered into the plan. So probably having a longer timeline for somebody's prep, even if it was the case to just have them ready a little bit early. So then you could have just a gradual shift to carbohydrates over a couple of weeks versus, some rapid increase over 1 week. As you said there, could just like throw off too many like different factors, way too much variance, a bit more of a risky approach could lead to worse outcomes. So I think, that's probably a good takeaway from that aspect.
Yeah, and if you just think about some of the basic biology that's involved in terms of the transport of different carbohydrates, whether it's across the gut or into skeletal muscle, then that requires time. And it brings up something which is tangential, but if you think about the people who are considering occasionally using very low carbohydrate diets for endurance athletes, because they thought, well, if we do this and we do it in a periodized way, then we're going to improve the ability of these people to use fat for fuel. And then at the last minute, we can load them with carbohydrate and they can turn up being really well fat adapted, but with full glycogen stores too. It's never really worked because actually when they load them with the carbohydrate, they're not able to use it as effectively. They can't store as much. There are various changes in the enzymes involved that we don't need to get into. And some of that is actually relevant to the bodybuilding context too, because if someone hadn't had a very high carbohydrate diet and then suddenly there's that big shift at the last minute, then they're just not going to store it as well in the tissues where you want to store it. So I would ramp things a bit more gradually.
Yeah. And obviously, like, the higher you go, there's going to be like way more like oxidation of carbohydrates too, just as a byproduct of just eating more. So there's only so much that will be able to be stored. And as well, like the harder you go too, there's always the risk that you just overdo it too, and then just ends up kind of ruining the look, which can be harder to pull back, or it's just less of it's not something you want to have to do during a peak week. It's have to pull back and cause more stress to the person who's undergoing.
I was going to say when they're already more stressed, at baseline, and then you're throwing in some massive shift at the last minute. It's not going to turn out well.
The final thing I want to ask you about is there anything worthwhile on the supplementation side of things that people could be taking to help with improving their sleep timing or their alertness around shift work?
So beyond the basics being the type of measured use of caffeine that I mentioned earlier. With respect to alertness, a lot of people will be doing this already, but I think there's very interesting evidence that creatine monohydrate can help maintain cognitive function, especially in the face of insufficient sleep. The same seems to be true of motor skills. The little research that's been done on rugby players like Christian Cook and Liam Kilduff and some others about 15 years ago now. And that showed that when rugby players had lost sleep, giving them a high dose of creatine could maintain their passing performance. So there's possibly an effect on sport-specific coordination, which is not so relevant to lifting weights. But my guess is that having high phosphocreatine and creatine stores in skeletal muscles around the time of insufficient sleep is going to help buffer you against performance decrements too. So I would say at these times, if you're really short on sleep, you're not well rested, then ensuring that you're creatine loaded is going to be helpful. There are different ways that you can go about that. If you're not currently taking creatine and you want to get your stores as high as possible, as quickly as possible, then you could go through a loading phase. Historically, loading has typically entailed something like 5 grams of creatine 4 times a day for 5 days, so 20 grams a day for 5 days. divided into different doses. You don't want to take too much at once because the solute load can cause some gastrointestinal distress. You could scale that to body weight, which I'm generally inclined to do with people, just because more muscle means more doors for creatine to enter cells. And so if you were loading, you could use something to the tune of 0.25 or 0.3 grams per kilogram during the loading phase. And then the maintenance phase, you might use a creatine dose that was a bit higher than normal, probably approaching twice what you would otherwise take. So if you normally took 5 grams of creatine monohydrate, if you're really short on sleep and you still want to train hard and respond well to the training, then you could double that to 10 grams. So creatine, playing with that a little bit is an option. With respect to cognition, the only other supplement really that's got some interesting evidence backing its ability to maintain some cognitive functions during insufficient sleep is L-tyrosine. And the rationale there is that L-tyrosine is a precursor to several monoamines, including noradrenaline and dopamine. And the levels of these at synapses can start to be compromised by extended wakefulness. You're just asking more of those synapses. And so by providing additional L-tyrosine, the rationale is that you can provide additional precursor to those monoamines and better maintain their levels over time. And there's some evidence that can help preserve cognition. It seems to be somewhat genotype dependent. It's not a home run, but it is an option. I think it's worth exploring for some people that really need to perform cognitively and they don't want to go the pharmaceutical route. And there are various issues with taking L-tyrosine, like how it competes with different amino acids and so on. But taking 1 to 2 grams of L-tyrosine, which would ideally probably be on an empty stomach, something like 30 minutes before some sort of hard cognitive task, is something that can work. But again, like based on the provisos I just mentioned there, it's not going to work in all contexts. Because maybe someone else is going to eat a lot around the time that they would be taking it and its effects are going to be washed out. There are just various factors that could confound that. So that's one of them. Then with respect to sleep, there are loads of supplements that do affect sleep in certain ways, and there are plenty of foods that seem to affect sleep too. I say that as if the evidence is really compelling and we've got loads of high quality randomized controlled trials. We don't. But that does seem to be the case. I think we would see that if we had more large-scale, well-powered trials of sufficient duration. But there are a few supplements that I think are interesting in this particular context. One of them, which is probably the one that I would default to if someone was just looking for a small additional boost to their recovery, and with some of that mediated by some improvements in sleep, would be tart cherry. And most of that work has used tart cherry concentrate. There's a product named Cherry Pure that you can look into. There's another one, Cherry Active. Cherry Active, I think, is the one that's been best studied. And it's typically taken as 30 milliliters of the concentrate twice a day, with one of those doses being shortly before sleep. And it seems to weakly improve some sleep parameters, especially in insomnia. Some of that work has included older people, but the reason why I like it for this population is because there's loads of other work showing that tart cherry can be ergogenic. And that's most true of endurance exercise performance. There are actually some quite impressive improvements in things like running performance from taking tart cherry, which seems to be mediated by a few different things like change in vascular function and maybe some effects on antioxidation. I'm less compelled by that rationale. But when it comes to resistance training and power training, tart cherry actually has quite a potent effect on exercise-induced muscle damage and recovery from training. And so when people take it before damaging exercise, they get less sore, they get less DOMS, and their strength and power recover faster than they otherwise would. And there hasn't really been research to look at whether it's improvements in sleep that mediates that effect, or whether that affects more direct actions of the cherry. Maybe it's a bit of both. It probably is a bit of both. But I think that is a really interesting option for these people. And the only downside is that it's quite expensive compared to a lot of supplements that you could take. So for someone who's more price sensitive, it might not be an option. But for people with more disposable income, I think it's an easy win potentially. And then the other potential sleep aids that I might consider with people would be glycine. There's a tiny bit of research, a lot of people overblow this research a lot, suggesting that taking about 3 grams of L-glycine shortly before sleep can help improve some sleep parameters and help maintain cognition when someone's a bit short on sleep. And the thing about L-glycine that I like is that it's really good for general health. And if people are interested in this, then they can check out a couple of podcasts that I recorded. My podcast is called Reason and Wellbeing, but I did a roundtable about longevity supplements recently with a couple of friends. And we spoke a bit about L-glycine in that, and the potential geroprotective or anti-aging effects of L-glycine are very interesting. It seems to be good for many different body systems, and it slightly extends the lifespan of both male and female mice, which we can't read into too much, but there are various reasons to think that it could have some anti-aging properties. So L-glycine is good for you generally. It might have a small effect on your sleep. There's no downside to it. So that would be one of them. And there is actually a bit of work, just slightly tangential, showing that taking some collagen not long before sleep, containing about 3 grams of L-glycine, can also improve sleep in people who are physically active. So an alternative would be just take about 10 grams of collagen powder at that time, if you want to support the remodeling of connective tissues too. Glycine will do that a bit, but some of the other amino acids, in particular hydroxyproline, probably relatively more important to that. So that'd be another option. And then we could start speaking about melatonin, but that's not widely available in Europe.
Yeah.
In terms of training stress and stress in general, the only other two that I would mention are very predictable, and one of them is ashwagandha. And the reason ashwagandha is interesting is because there's a tiny bit of work showing that it improves adaptations to exercise. People gain slightly more muscle, they lose slightly more fat in response to resistance training, and they also might improve their performance a little bit more than people that are taking a placebo. And that work has used a couple of different types of ashwagandha. The best studied type of ashwagandha is called KSM66, which you take as 600 milligrams. Ashwagandha's got just about the largest effect of all dietary supplements tested on cortisol. So it tends to bring down cortisol a bit, suggesting that it can appease stress responses in general somewhat. It also has almost the strongest effect on testosterone in men of the different supplements that have been well tested. And it can raise testosterone by probably somewhere in the region of 10 to 15% when it's taken consistently over time. The issue with ashwagandha is that it's quite promiscuous. It hits lots of different biological targets. And there are a few reports in the literature of liver damage. And they're isolated case studies. But there's word on the street in Europe, this is coming from someone who's worked in the supplement industry and continues to do so, although at the moment I'm working with a North American company. There's word on the street that ashwagandha might be pulled from the European market, and I don't know if that's true of all ashwagandha products or if that's true of a couple of specific brands. I won't name those brands. Might just be one specific brand. So ashwagandha is interesting, but it's something where I'd feel most comfortable with someone taking it if they're getting regular blood work and their liver markers look fine consistently over time. I myself have taken it on and off. I haven't taken it for a couple of years, but I've taken it on and off, and I've never seen any obvious changes in any of my health parameters. So not too concerned about it, but it's just something to bear in mind. And then the other is just L-theanine. And L-theanine is also under slightly strange regulatory status in that, technically speaking, in Europe, I think if you want to sell L-theanine, then it needs to come from a green tea extract. For some bizarre reason, the synthetic form of L-theanine, the best study form of that is suntheanine, but it's all the same fundamentally. The synthetic form has actually been regulated against, but a lot of companies continue to sell it because it's not policed. So it's bizarre that it is regulated because L-theanine is very safe, and it's, again, something that you get from green tea anyway and a few other commonly consumed items. And it slightly reduces stress responses, both in terms of stress hormones, but perceptions of stresses too. So people feel like stressful things are marginally less stressful. It has some modest positive effects on some markers of general health, including immune function and vascular function, and it slightly improves some sleep parameters for some people. The reason that I personally like L-theanine is because it seems to counter some of the effects of caffeine on sleep. And so the way that I personally use it is, being a coffee addict, being someone that loves coffee, if I ever have just way too much coffee, I'll just take a bit of L-theanine that day too, to try and offset some of the effects of the caffeine on my sleep. So this isn't a recommendation to go ahead and consume a gram of caffeine each day, and then if you just take 200 milligrams of L-theanine, you sleep like a baby. That is not the case. But it does seem to slightly attenuate some of the effects of caffeine on sleep. And so if you think about the general population and caffeine consumption and some of the coffee and dark chocolate and tea lovers out there, I think L-theanine certainly has its place. Again, the safety profile is very good, despite the bizarre ruling in Europe. So 200 milligrams of L-theanine within a couple of hours of sleep is another interesting option too. They would be the main ones. There are so many more. You've got to take it depending on what the person wants, depending on the other supplements they're taking, depending on medications they're taking. There are all sorts of factors that play into this. People speak about supplements too simplistically. They also often recommend supplements for sleep that frankly aren't very effective. And there are other supplements that people will have heard others discuss in the context of sleep, like various magnesium products and so on. Magnesium, I'll just mention it because it comes up so frequently. It doesn't seem to do much for sleep, but it really hasn't been very well studied. And I find the magnesium discussions very entertaining. I mean, I don't really pay any attention to them anymore. But people will speak about how magnesium L-threonate is great for sleep because it's so good at getting in the brain. And then show me the research that actually demonstrates this. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's very strange. So with magnesium, what I would say is that if it affects sleep, then the effects on sleep are, on average, very, very, very modest. If it does affect sleep, though, then it's most likely to do so, I believe, in people who just aren't consuming nearly enough magnesium. And that's true of quite a few people. And people who are training hard and sweating a lot probably have slightly higher magnesium needs than other people who are more sedentary and losing less through their skin. And for that reason, I'm very pro magnesium supplementation for the general population because it has so many positive effects on other things. It's just not that it affects sleep much. It will tend to reduce your blood pressure a bit, probably improves your blood sugar control a little bit, probably marginally improves some blood lipids. It has some weak effects on mood in some people that are generally beneficial. It, depending on the form that you use, can be used to alleviate constipation. The uses of it go on and on. But for the most part, I think a lot of people are going to benefit from magnesium supplementation. One of the reasons that it should be of interest to people listening to this is that it seems to support muscle recovery from exercise. And that's something that has been relatively neglected, actually. It hasn't really been aired much in conversations about magnesium, but there's certainly some evidence showing that to be the case. Taking quite high dose of magnesium, admittedly, but I think a lot of people, they'll do well just taking a few hundred milligrams of magnesium citrate a day. Probably don't need to take that year round. It doesn't need to be a fancy, expensive form of magnesium. The huge majority of research on magnesium is on some of the forms that have been around for a while, and I think citrate probably has the strongest evidence behind it. It's also really inexpensive. It's quite water soluble, and it's readily available. So I would just default to that.
That was pretty much a supplement masterclass there for a lot of different things there. So we have creatine there for helping improve alertness. We have tart cherry. Was that also good for the sleep, right?
Tart cherry. So it's creatine and L-tyrosine.
Yeah, L-tyrosine.
For cognition during insufficient sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we also had likes of L-theanine and ashwagandha for kind of adaptations to training. It's interesting you mentioned the creatine there. Obviously, like I think anybody who's active on social media in the fitness industry, you see all these kind of like infographics going around. Well, I was in Ibiza 2 weeks ago, and one of my friends sent me like an infographic, and that is like, just take 30 grams of creatine and you'll be fine.
Yeah, the solution to all of life's problems.
I guess my kind of anytime I see like those kind of like things going around, I'm always like, if I had 30 grams of creatine today, my stomach would be in bits, you know. So it might help maybe one area, but I don't know if it's going to pull back in others.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. And the higher the dose of creatine that you consume, the more you need to split it up into individual doses. So if you were taking, I would say that if you're taking 10 grams or more a day, you should divvy it up. And probably individual dose of 5 grams makes sense. There's a question that hasn't been asked, which is whether consuming large amounts of creatine close to sleep affects sleep. Because there was this brilliant work by Marcus Dvorak and his colleagues 8 years ago now that was really some of the early work looking at the effects of creatine on sleep specifically. And they found that when they added creatine to the chow of rodents, they ended up sleeping less and their sleep was less deep. And they had less rebound sleep after sleep loss. And then they looked at what was going on in their brains and they found that their brain creatine stores were higher, and they found that there was less accumulation of adenosine in the brain. And adenosine is the main physiological correlate of that pressure to sleep that I described earlier. So if you think about caffeine and how that affects sleep, then caffeine antagonizes all of the adenosine receptors. And so it blocks the interaction of the sleep promoting signal with its receptors in the brain. What creatine does is it reduces the amount of adenosine that accumulates in the first place. So it acts via a related but different mechanism. And that affects sleep structure in rodents. There's now some early work looking at whether that's true of humans, and I don't know what to make of the data yet. I think it's too early to tell. I don't think the effects on human sleep will be nearly as substantial, in part because creatine can increase brain creatine stores much more in, say, mice than it can in people. It can boost the creatine stores of mice by about 30%. Can boost the creatine stores in the brain of humans by about 9%. So I don't think it's going to affect our sleep nearly as much. There are other things related to creatine that might have a much bigger effect on brain creatine. So the most potent of those might be guanidinoacetic acid. And this I've just seen a couple of influencer types start to post about this recently, saying you should take GAA because it's great, it makes you strong, and it's related to creatine, and you end up with all these high energy stores. And honestly, I'd say it's a bit irresponsible, and it's probably not deliberately so. It's probably just a reflection of ignorance, being frank. The issue with GAA is that it tends to massively push up your homocysteine, which is not good for your cardiovascular risk or your risk of dementia. And one of the cool things about creatine is that it tends to push down your homocysteine because of some of its effects on methylation. And so it could be that the best approach is to take some small amount of GAA with some creatine to counter the effects of the GAA on the homocysteine. And that way you'll be able to boost brain creatine stores a lot more, which will then help preserve brain function in particular during insufficient sleep. That research hasn't been done yet. And the person who has done pretty much all of the research on GAA is called Serge Ostoyik. And he's a very good scientist. So I've always got one eye on what Serge is up to. But meanwhile, because so many people are speaking about creatine now, the influencer world has just discovered creatine when the sports science world has been talking about creatine for the last 35 years. It's just quite funny. But now people are like, oh, well, there's creatine, and then there's this other stuff that's related to creatine. Should we just take that too? The good news is that GAA is not widely available at all. So even if someone wants to take it, they'd find it hard to find a good source, and it would probably be very expensive at this point. So don't do that. But that was a long-winded way of saying that creatine might affect sleep. Now, I wonder if taking a big dose of creatine late in the day could reduce sleep a little bit and reduce the depth of sleep. My guess is that we would see that if we had good electrophysiological measures of sleep. If someone was using polysomnography and they took 30 grams of creatine within 4 hours of going to bed, I think that we would see that their electrical activity would change quite a lot.
Yeah, I guess it's the supplement that just seems to keep on giving in regards to like things we're finding out about it. When you're kind of talking about the GAA there, I was just thinking about this yesterday, like because I've started to see a lot of people in natural bodybuilding supplement with things. No, not GAA, but things that just seem to have been coming onto the market like more recently, and like
what are some examples?
Like SLUPP 332. It's like a peptide, And there's a few other ones like methylene blue and
methylene blue is having its sort of heyday at the moment, probably in part because of RFK.
Yeah, there's another few. As I seen them, I was just like, I'm interested to see, like, you know, how, like, what kind of categories do you fall under with WADA, and, like, you know, like the SLU PP 332 apparently, because it's not approved for like human use. Like, it's gonna be in tier 1, so it's like it's banned completely.
Stay the hell away from peptides for now. And obviously peptides are a huge category, and you know, if we speak about peptides, we could speak about collagen peptides too. They're not all created equal, but some of these experimental peptides that a lot of people are pushing and a lot of people are taking that cost a lot of money, I would not touch them with a barge pole.
Yeah,
and I think that's both because we don't have the clinical trials on them, but also because that world is just not regulated. They exist in this weird grey zone, and if you order one of these, then don't assume that your order contains exactly what it claims to.
Yeah, like what I was thinking about was like, it's way better to be like a late adopter when it does come to supplements, especially if you're competing in intense competitions. Like, my supplement list is very short, and that's just because I'm very conscious of the fact that, like, you know, some supplement companies can be there could be issues with dosing, there could be issues with like tampering, all this kind of stuff. So the less ones I take, the less risk I put on myself. You know, so this is one thing I consider. Look, Greg, I've taken up enough of your time on this lovely Thursday evening, so thank you very, very much for all of the words of wisdom you've kind of given all the listeners. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or any kind of final words of wisdom you'd like to leave the listeners with?
No, I don't think so. I think the theme that has run through our conversation today has been, if you are a shift worker, then just recognise that you're a little different from your day working counterparts. So don't assume that you can push quite as hard as they can, which isn't to say that you should think of yourself as not being resilient. You are resilient, and frankly, you're probably psychologically a lot more resilient than us soft day workers. But bear that in mind. Bear in mind what we were speaking with respect to regularity and understanding how things affect your clock, but also the fact that your clock isn't that adaptable. It can't shift around that fast, and a lot of people, their clocks tend to stay a little bit stuck during the daytime. So if anything, keep things over in that direction if you're in doubt, and you can make that work with your schedule. And then the final thing I would just say is, if you found anything that I've said today interesting, then I'll shamelessly plug my podcast, which is called Reason and Wellbeing. It's available everywhere where you find podcasts. It's also on YouTube, which is, I think, at Greg Potter PhD. And that's quite wide ranging. I don't just speak about sleep or exercise or what have you. I've covered many subjects so far, everything from most recently Alzheimer's disease to previously blood donation, back pain, obesity, lithium, the list goes on and on. So I try and keep myself entertained, and that means that I speak to lots of very smart people about many different subjects, but there is a theme that runs through them. And if you're interested in sustainably improving your health and performance, then I hope you enjoy it.
Awesome. Yeah, look, I will make sure to link that in the description. I've listened to many of them. I haven't listened to some of the more recent ones, but maybe I should. Because after this conversation, I'm like, Jesus Christ, I'm so damn dumb. I need to read more. It's great talking to you. If you did enjoy the podcast in the audience, do make sure to leave us a rating and review of the podcast platform you're listening on. Go over, follow Greg's podcast, follow him on Instagram. I'll leave it in the description, as I said. And until next week, we will talk again.